My purpose in this session is to reflect on some of the recent developments, which we have not yet much discussed here, with regard to what's been happening in the last, well, year and a half or so as the pandemic started, and what our responses have been, what other activities in which we have engaged as indicators of the future of digital libraries, to be frank. The first, of course, is that on the 13th of March, we all went home, and fundamentally, the university closed down entirely until months later. Basically, everything went quiet for 6 or 7 months. We closed our libraries. And as remote instruction began, entirely remote instruction for courses, we in the libraries had to swiftly adjust to this changed environment, supporting these courses with 100% e-services, e-reserves, e-content. In doing this, we had to have new understandings with some of our suppliers, aggregators such as publishers and vendors, and aggregators such as the Hathi Trust, which fundamentally has a collection of books digitized in the Google Book Project that makes content available under terms. And we also had to resolve how we supplied on an emergency basis digital copies of items which weren't in digital form in order to support these courses. This involved, of course, the use of our digitization labs and getting our staff into and out of those labs without transmitting the COVID-19 virus. It also involves some cooperation with our Office of General Counsel to, in effect, reinterpret under emergency conditions the understandings that we have with regard to the copyright law in America and what we could do and what we couldn't do. Basically, things were loosened in support of research and teaching. This is an element of the fair use clauses of our copyright law. All that occurred very quickly and very ably. I must compliment, in particular, our Digital Library Systems and Services group under Tom for making these changes effective. I have to compliment, and gladly so, our acquisitions librarians, and particularly our negotiator on contracts and licenses, and with our catalogers. So it was possible for our students and our instructors to understand what was available and how to get to it. We had to integrate with our academic continuity team so that there was a complete understanding of what was available in terms of advice to instructors and to students, and understandings about behavior in the remote learning environment. We have been teaching, we librarians at Stanford have been teaching tools and techniques. We call it training, not teaching, but because these are non-credit courses, but they are quite important, and many students, particularly graduate students, take them. So we have remote instruction on such things as the R and Python coding environments, on the use of AI in research, on what we call digital carpentry, which is essentially more like digital architecture without danger for individuals to begin to figure out how to cobble together research and environments for themselves out of what applications are available. We've had specific instruction on various services that we offer, particularly on discovery, but not solely so. The third item I'd like to mention to you goes to one of my friend M.G. Sri Kumar's remarks about special collecting, special collections. And I have to say that we have been very busy in this pandemic time, increasing our acquisition or licensing of digital resources, including, of course, data sets, but somewhat also for text and image sets. We have been providing digital labs for analysis, where formerly students would come to our digital lab for sources and analysis in person. They now would get those services remotely, and our staff of that service had to help them mash up new data sets from combinations of existing data sets. We have been busy understanding the relevance of some of our data sets and their new applications, and encouraging reporting on key findings of relevance for an inclusion in our Stanford Digital Repository, which is both a repository and a digital archive, two different faces of that same service. All of that maintained by the Digital Library Systems and Services Group under Tom Kramer. We have promoted a service attitude. We recruit and retain people on the basis of their joy, really, in having a good service attitude in support of students and professors at Stanford. And we have seen that these service attitudes result in such services as providing carts with 3D printers and instructions on how to use them, sometimes with laptops included, with applications that drive those 3D printers in situations where our engineering students couldn't go into their labs. So we have loaned these makers carts around and about the campus so that basic experimentation, really, and experience with actual engineering can occur. We've been supporting research in similar ways, even though the researchers aren't on campus and are not coming into our libraries. But we have been providing them with information resources, and where necessary, we've digitized ones which are not available and weren't available in virtual form, so that they could be available in digital form and thus distributed to specific researchers. We have, of course, over these really centuries, been understood by humanists, social scientists, area studies scholars as reliable and consistent services for research library methods and content. We have built our clientele in those disciplines in such a way that they understand that we anticipate to the best of our abilities what they need, because we understand what their research programs are, and then build to those research programs. And interestingly, we've also been building discovery services, often at the times of what we might call traditional or classic cataloging, but also in the form of finding aids and these exhibits that I mentioned previously that bring together items that might ordinarily not have been together, or exposing more deeply the content that is available in some of our special collections, which might otherwise be relatively obscure. So whereas the humanists, the social scientists, and the area studies people have all understood that, now the STEM faculty here are discovering, these professors are discovering and requesting that the Stanford librarians manage collections of specimens. They want us to help them by providing logistical support and discovery support for specimen collections mainly used in teaching, but not solely so. They've begun to respect our logistical possibilities and ultimately also our programs of providing access, intellectual access, by use of various kinds of metadata. This is a new field opening up for us, but we have numerous of our STEM professors who are now interested. And indeed, we have the research leadership, the strategic leadership of the university, interested in adopting our expertise, and indeed, depending on many cases on our expertise, to manage such services, managing and providing access, physical access to physical specimen collections, and providing metadata that will be generated by knowledgeable experts in these disciplines about what these specimens are for use mainly in teaching and learning, but some for research. And of course, places like Stanford have huge specimen collections, rocks, birds, mammals, fish, organ systems, all kinds of things extracted from the human body and stored for further research and learning. So it's an interesting time because whereas we have lots and lots of digital possibilities, and certainly the data sets, image sets, and text sets are heavily used, we also see the rise of the use of what we might call library and archival sciences in support of providing access to these specimen collections, some of which were generated over decades, if not centuries. I think a precursor to this is our excellent work in supporting the use of maps, first by collecting them, secondly by providing physical access to them, intelligent access, so that they could go to map series and discover what we have and then how to make use of it in their studies. And indeed, in the early years of the geology program here at Stanford, I'm now talking about the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, one of the exercises that had to be engaged by students, particularly graduate students, was mapping, how to make a map. But now we are making use of maps in new and different ways. Maps as carriers of information and links to information, maps which show the historical development of conceptions of space and navigation, actual physical navigation, which lead ultimately to GPS systems and satellite-based navigation. The point I'm making here is that our expertise in certain areas, metadata in particular, physical conservation, and our commitment to logical workflows and logistics in general is now becoming visible to more people in the academy, particularly strategic leadership, and thus calls upon us to assume leadership and management roles for providing access and preservation of these specimen collections. We also, as I've mentioned earlier, I think, are contributing to Stanford, but also to other institutions, applications that are vital and generalizable in support of various functions of the libraries in the form of applications that enable ordinary mortals to make use of technologies to support digital exhibits, to share information, to provide streaming of information objects and cultural objects with opportunities for annotation, measurement, examination, even sophisticated light systems to provide views beneath the surface of various kinds of manuscripts. These are all open source, and they're all dedicated to improved research and teaching and sharing and collaboration. We have experience, as I mentioned, with our friends at the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, with image recognition software, which is developing new methodologies, and in coordination with the International Image Interoperability Framework, new possibilities for sharing and for collaboration at great distances from source materials. These also lead to new interpretations of cultural artifacts and cultural documents. My friend MG has mentioned the initial special collections in which the Geo Institute is investing. One is the history of Mumbai from 1900, a vital time in the history of India and in the history of Mumbai, going from a period of development on the basis of really the occupation of India by the UK, by British management and leadership, to the independence of your nation and the flowering of science, teaching, religion, economics, politics, trade, world trade, and the sense of self-realization by the nation and its citizens in their own destinies as they define them, as they had defined them. So this examination of the history of Mumbai is perhaps, I say perhaps, a recognition in a miniature of the whole experience of India, and as a model for debate, for improvement, perhaps useful for examination of other major cities and rural areas even of India, for better self-understanding of the Indian history and situation in this terribly interesting time, starting with the occupation of India by the UK and then leading to independence from the UK and the development of another independent India that had precursors going back thousands of years. So I think this is really the possibility of developing a narrative that could be challenged and should be, but also could be quite useful in teaching school kids about their own country and their own regions and their own cities. There's also a lot of learning to be done based on what artifacts, what documents, what images we can get, and then turn into what amounts to an exhibit that is in effect a textbook, a growing and changing textbook or monograph on the history of Mumbai, once again, as an exemplar of the history of the whole nation. And for those of us who haven't been raised in India, the history of Mumbai is both terribly significant and terribly interesting. And understanding it better and all the developments that are occurring and have occurred in and around Mumbai, in the province of Maharashtra, will help us understand better what's going on and what has gone on. The other great study that has started in primordial form, to be frank, is one on Indian art and architecture. This is a fascinating multivariate study which will be built up in layers and what I might call puzzle pieces, which over a very long period of time will develop a picture, a kind of assemblage of a puzzle that has to do with how Indian art and architecture has developed. And by art, I mean the arts really, music and dance and literature and theater and all the plastic and fine arts, all the crafts that go into making a civilization, and the architectures that surround them and support them too. This is a vast subject. There's been an enormous amount of work that's been done on it, but I think there's some dots that could be connected, and certainly some new narratives or new aspects of narratives based on archival documents, on manuscripts, on work done and realized that have not yet been knitted into a narrative about Indian arts and architecture. Some of that having grown up in the time of the UK occupation of your country, some of it having grown up centuries before, surviving the occupation and then re-elaborating that architecture and those arts. Of course, an important aspect is the exportation of some of those art forms elsewhere in the world to great appreciation by others. And really a terrific model of how India has influenced other art cultures around the world. These special collections will be built and are being built by combinations of expertise in teams. So subject and area studies, scholars and librarians, by participants in cultural events, by collections that have been gathered by individuals, but also by governmental agencies and such entities as private and public museums. There's a lot of work to be done here, but it can only be done by these teams. And that's our experience at Stanford. And I'm sure it's going to be your experience as well. A topic that will be presented in abstract, really, in the concluding segment on day 5 is that of the use of linked data, resource description frameworks in triples and quads that make the association of ideas, of dates, of places, of people, events, documents of all kinds, cultural objects of all kinds, entertainment, edutainment, petroglyphs even, biological specimens, possible by having simple statements about parameters, aspects of all sorts of ideas, objects, points of time, points of geography, etc., which over time will build up a gigantic 3 or 4 dimensional grid of these parameters, each of which is potentially related to similar or the very same parameters in other aspects of the history, culture, collections, etc., of India and of other places. This is a growing development of a technology that's been around for a while, but never was really applied very well. But now we are applying it, and you will see in the Share VDE environment and in the applications from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in their data.bnf.fr online service that demonstrates how drawing together information from over almost 200 catalogs and other finding aids at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France has enabled a systematic view of what the holdings of that great, great National Library, started so many centuries ago, can be seen in a consolidated way. I very much recommend you look at data.bnf.fr and understand how it presents this information. But the basis of that those consolidated views of an author, a musician, an event, a time, a place, are all based on the use of linked data, resource description framework statements. This is different than the application of AI, and it's different than what has been the traditional use of fixed and variable fields in the machine readable cataloging system that was developed in the US and then made use of elsewhere, really around the world. It's much more flexible. It's much more easy for those simple parameters to be compared and related across many, many different collections and collection types for new understandings of relationships among objects, and thus new knowledge, new methodologies, new interpretations, formerly completely hidden and thus missed. The idea is to improve access and therefore reduce the number of missed opportunities for discovery and thus for application in teaching and research and in lifelong learning. Another aspect of our work, which I have mentioned and I now mention again, is collaborating with individuals, among individuals and among institutions in developing new methods in our professional work and in our services to the general public. These sharing methods are dependent mainly on us having agreements that we have something to give, whether it's an organizational model, items from our collections, architectural insights, preservation work, showing ways in which we might, across many different institutions, support certain kinds of archival research. I'm now thinking of the great work we're doing with the National Library of Israel and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France on the life and works of a famous filmmaker, both a documentary filmmaker and a maker of fiction films, by the name of Amos Gittai. Gittai is Israeli, but he spent a lot of time in France, and he got his PhD at UC Berkeley. So he's established collections of his archival materials on what I would call clusters of films he's made, with outtakes, with the whole films, and with all the archival documents that arise from making a major documentaries, hour-long documentaries on contemporary topics at 3 places: Stanford and BNF and National Library. Whoever is speaking, I'd like you to mute yourself, please, and stay muted. Thank you. And what's happening is a collaborative effort among archivists at those 3 institutions so as to provide a unified approach to understanding what is available to study from Gittai's very professional life, very productive professional life, I might add. This is providing our archivists in each of these institutions with new insights on choices made at the other institutions. And Gittai himself is really thrilled with these developments, really happy. So I see us, how to say this? I see this experiencing in the form of this collaboration some new possibilities, some new insights, thanks to working with one another. This is just a terrific thing. I now turn to a project that we have recently announced in our beginning work in a more or less public way after years of coming to understandings with the institution that holds all of the documents that are pertinent to what I'm about to present. Please mute yourself. Please mute yourself. Thank you. You all know the horrors of the Second World War at some level or another. After the end of that war, in which the fascist regimes in Italy and Germany were subdued by the Allies in what became a worldwide conflict, even in India, Southeast Asia, East Asia. I forgot to mention the Japanese forces and engagement in this world war. There were trials. There were trials by allied nations to identify those responsible for the horrors of World War II, particularly the terrible killings of Jews and Gypsies and other persons regarded as subhuman or damaged humans, or the use of those people as forced laborers who were so poorly treated that most of them simply died in the course of their work for their masters, or the people that had stolen them. The first and biggest of these trials was that of the trial of Nuremberg, the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg, the trial that was conducted in 1945 and 46, that resulted in a gigantic collection of documents arising from the trial: transcripts, depositions, audio files, actually some moving image files, and lots of still images as evidence, and as the trial was recorded. But until recently, all of this evidence, all of these transcripts, and all of this extra material was not available together. It was the four powers that conducted the initial Nuremberg trial, the four powers being the United Kingdom, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States, gave all of those transcripts to the Peace Palace and the International Court of Justice in The Hague, in the Netherlands. Over the past, I would say, 7 years, all of that material has been digitized and provided with extensive metadata. But the Peace Palace does not have the capacity to present all this material itself. Whereas they did terrific work with the help of donor institutions to make the digitization happen, they could not present it. So we and a couple of the sponsoring institutions, the US Holocaust Museum and a similar organization in Israel, paid for the digitization, and indeed are providing access to some of that digitized material. But after several years of conversations with our colleagues at the Peace Palace in the Library and Documentation Service, we at Stanford are now commissioned to present a high-functioning digital archive of all that material in one virtual place, with linkages internal to all that material, so that one might move from the audio file to the transcript, to the evidence presented, and thus to the judgments. This effort, this monumental effort by the four powers, and ultimately by our friends and colleagues of the International Court of Justice and in the Peace Palace, have given us, among others, the responsibility of making this archive available to the world. The importance of the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg, 1945 to 46, is multifold, but principally, it has resulted in understandings that have created the international criminal courts, and for that matter, the reconciliation efforts in various countries, including South Africa, to reconcile the differences, often of terrible human tragedies, so that these nations might work better together, but also that we might recognize and punish the perpetrators of mass violence and genocide in our own time. So the UN, international courts, criminal courts, and the individual countries who have, and are in clusters of nations who have conducted what amounts to human rights courts, are based upon the findings and principles of the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg 45-46. These criminal courts are continuing to develop as horrors show up in our lives and in various nations. The interesting thing is that it's never been possible for someone to look across all of the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg 45-46 to understand exactly what happened in all cases. And indeed, there were 12 subordinate trials in Nuremberg that dealt with the companies that had contributed to the Holocaust, to the terrible genocide, and to the invasions across Europe and indeed across the world. Beyond these principal dozen subordinate trials, there are almost 490 other trials of individuals that had committed atrocities. The documents of the 12 subordinate trials and the almost 489 trials, and the preparations for another many trials of individuals and teams of people, groups of individuals who had committed these terrible attacks on humans and communities of humans in the period of the Second World War, are now becoming available. We are working to make these documents available. It will take us some years to do this, but the initial presentation, I suspect, will take us only a couple of years to make available to the world. This is an example of both a collecting philosophy, which has to do with our sense of responsibility for making documents about hugely important events visible to all, on the one hand, and on the other hand, our promotion of the rights of humans to peaceful lives, to lives without threat to the maximum extent possible. And it also reflects on our intentions as a collective. I'm now talking about the people at the International Court of Justice Library and Documentation Service, and those who sponsored the digitization, particularly of the media materials that were basically invisible as a result of technical problems over the decades since 1945-46, and others, including people who are helping us with money to make possible these developments so that all of this information can be seen. Toward the development of a common understanding about the use and practice of the international criminal courts and helping to subdue the terrible, terrible instincts of some people to harm whole legions of other people. The Rwanda situation, the former Yugoslavia situation, the situation in, where was Harvey, the African dictator who committed genocide on a competitor tribe. The trial was actually conducted in Senegal. The reconciliation work and trial in Cambodia on the Pathet Lao, and the terrible, terrible damage done to that society by murders. Well, eventually, with some continued negotiation and commitment, both on the part of those nations themselves and those who conducted those trials, as well as institutions like Stanford, will present those results with insights for others to learn from. We're also involved in collecting the trial transcripts and other materials from the Japanese equivalent of the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg, which didn't deal with the war in East Asia. All of this in support of better understanding, better governance, more research, better teaching and learning, more common understandings, and by common I mean general understandings among us, about how we might and must deal with these infractions of human rights in ways that protects others in the future from having to deal with such infractions of genocide and mass violence. Terribly important. We have in our world today and our lives today, of course, continued conflicts between nations, sometimes within nations. There were just a great many people killed in India, apparently by Maoist rebels. 32 people killed, many, many other people terribly wounded. We have violence in our times and in our places. We need to find out how to reduce that. We have problem with food source and food supply and the delivery of food to people. That problem will only get worse unless we attend to it. We have huge problems with providing pure water to our people. Water for human consumption, water for growing crops, water for watering herds, water for washing and cleaning. We need pure water for all of that. And pure water is becoming an increasingly difficult commodity, and the distribution of it ditto. And we have this climate change challenge, which we have not recognized. The Paris Accords are a good start, but only a start. And all of us have to pitch in, and all nations have to pitch in, or the pollution of our planet will eventually kill off the human species. It will revert to a more primitive state. Digitizing and providing access to documents about all these challenges could result in contributions to the resolution of these terrible social, scientific, and environmental issues. How can we not contribute to those solutions in our professional work? How can we not be personally committed to resolving, or at least providing information to those who would resolve these issues and make progress towards the solution of these terrible, terrible problems? I'm so concerned about the lives of my children and my grandchildren, about your children and your grandchildren. You are the generation that inherits this problem. I will not outlive these problems. You may, and you have it in your power, along with others like you, in our business, in our profession, to affect change, to affect the solutions that could result by the applications of information, innovative thinking, engineering, basic research, and applied research. So the implications of our work on the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg, 1945-46 trial, transcripts, audio recordings, images, are a step meant to improve our thinking about how we deal with terrible problems together. We see it as one of our great contributions to humankind in these days, presenting evidence from an attempt in history, not so many years ago, 7 decades ago, to resolve a terrible conflict in a way that advances and advances the cause of peace and equity in our time. not perfectly realized, not even realized on a steady plane of development, but nevertheless quite important. All of these 9 main themes that I've mentioned to you have been underway recently at Stanford and expose the potential of the digital library to be of use in so many settings. These are contemporary developments, very contemporary developments, that in effect show the future of digital libraries as contributors to research and teaching, lifelong learning, and community understanding in such a way as to be able to attempt to approach and confront these terrible problems facing all of us. They're based on experiences we've had in the recent past and really over a longer past. And it goes to my initial remarks, which have to do with the contributions you will make as part of this workshop, working in teams and listening to experts on developments which are quite current and are being applied as implications and indicators and stimuli for similar developments or even quite different ones over the course of the next years, decades, and even longer generations, made possible by our common understandings of how we work together and made possible by the investments made by Mukesh Ambani and his family through the Resilience Foundation for the improvement of higher education in India, and by collaboration, first with Stanford, but already with other universities around the world in collaborative programs of instruction and research. So with that, I'm going to conclude.